Okay, I would say that granted that the intervention was multilateral, the multilateral entities trying to change the regime have to ensure first and foremost that the conditions that arise after that change are not worse than the conditions that existed before their intervention. If you pick the case of Iraq, for instance, many Iraqis, not the radical types, unfortunately say that conditions under Saddam Hussein, and this was reported by the Washington Post in 2007 in an elaborate article, that conditions were better. How better? They had security. They can open their little shops till midnight without worrying about somebody shooting them. The public education was free. Hospitals were free, and all of these. Now that there has been intervention to remove Saddam Hussein, they are not enjoying these things that were there before. So you see, the history of humanitarian intervention, whether by one state or multilateral entity as like the United Nations, has been very mixed and without acceptable outcomes, indeed. So if you look at it from that standpoint, you look at the fact that when nations intervene, they should intervene mainly to offer the humanitarian services that are needed and leave the regime alone. But that is an impossibility because sometimes the regime, as we see in Sudan, is opposed to doing those kinds of things. So it's a very difficult situation and it's a mixed bag.
Absolutely. And Antonio, do you want to add something? Sir?
Yes, I was thinking a little bit when you asked this question about, what should we do? We can look at just the outcome of World War I and World War II and see what happened, right? At World War I, they taxed the Germans so much that they penalized them to the point to where bankruptcy that allowed the nationalism and the Nazi movement to come in. And that ends up creating World War II. At the end of World War II, we have the Marshall Plan where we go in and help our former enemies. We go in and rebuild Germany. We go in and rebuild Japan, and they become our best allies.
Right.
And that is one way that we did have a responsibility to them after having gone in, and those regimes did need to be changed, at least in the case of Europe. And so there's a case where when we go in and we do things the right way, now whether or not we have the ability to do that financially, as you mentioned about where we're at now in terms of the budget, that's a separate issue. But when done correctly, my enemies can become my friends because they'll see that I really did have the best interests of their people at heart.
Very good, and it does seem to be where we want to go. But as you mentioned earlier, all of you have mentioned to some extent the fact that the U.S., we have our own self-interest we want to protect and we want to further. And there's a very fine line of balance between furthering our self-interest and doing the proper engagement or meting out the proper engagement with these foreign entities. That balance is hard to seek, but I would have to imagine that given a time like today, especially on a domestic front, where we're dealing with such scarce resources across the board for so many Americans, that line is harder to seek. It's more blurred because ultimately our self-interest, and if we go back to the Middle East, we have this addiction to oil. We definitely depend on oil, and we would be remiss if we didn't mention the fact that many of our policy efforts are meant to stabilize that region, even if it is at the expense of the individuals who are on the ground in those countries that we're a part of and who are suffering. So at the end of the day, when it comes to this long-term notion of proper engagement, that's understandable, but the immediacy of our self-interest, it seems to dictate that even we as American citizens might indirectly promote the policy that we ideologically might not agree with. Would you agree with that point?
Well, I look at it this way. The model of intervention plus, which is characterized as nation building and the imposition of a new friendly regime on another nation, worked in Japan and Germany. I'm not sure that it would work as well as in Iraq and in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, you have heard the U.S. foreign policy makers say that nation building is the objective. You stabilize the regime and you have somebody in power who is friendly to our interests and friendly to democratization. Then you have nation building going on. We have been in Afghanistan for about 10 years. And you can see that Some Afghan people are saying in a PBS program this past week, saying that fighting is like delicious food to them. They will fight until they die. That is not what the Japanese did. That is not what the Germans did. They surrendered, and then they had nation building to take place. I think that that particular model that you suggested in terms of the post-World War II may not work as well today.
Oh, and I think that's an important point. It's like in the post 9/11 world, it's not the same as the old European wars. The rules of engagement have changed. There's
Right.
no rules, essentially.
Right.
And there's just, suicide bombers. I mean, they don't follow a code.
Right.
And the enemy is not a nation. It's not a tangible entity. It's almost an ideology
Right.
that's across the world.
Right.
And how do you fight an idea, essentially? And how do you fight an enemy who kills themselves?
Right.
There's no fear.
Right.
But that's where the Arab Spring offers a alternative. I mean, while we've seen all those protests, as many people have mentioned, the pictures of Osama bin Laden have been missing from those protests. And that bodes well for our future, for our relations with those countries. And it's imperative that we provide them the support and not get involved in any of our past habits of going in and looking at it from an economic point of view, which is just short-sighted in terms of our oil and intervention in that area. Because for long-term relationships, to be able to create a stabilized Middle East, which is going to benefit both us and the Europeans and the Russians, we need to take the longer view and allow them to have their own history evolve. Because many people don't really even recall that the nation of Iran had a democracy. It was flourishing in the 1940s and 1950s. And it was only once the threat of oil had come up that Eisenhower okayed a covert CIA operation to go in and take down the democratically elected government in Iran and end up installing the Shah of Iran, who ran his death squads until the 1980s, which posed so much of a problem for the people of that generation to trust Americans and to trust the U.S. government, that we're still suffering from that. And so we need to be more open.
Antonio, you mentioned the Arab Spring, and not to cut you off, we'll get back in 1 second, but you mentioned the Arab Spring. Given the reality of the Arab Spring, which may or may not lead to an Arab summer, is that a repudiation, a direct repudiation of our foreign policy towards Iraq and Afghanistan? Would you guys agree with that or disagree?
I don't think the Arab Spring is a response to America necessarily. I think it's a response to the oppression that they've experienced from their own regimes in their countries. And it wasn't something that America did that set it off. It was that man in Tunisia who was so, distraught by his life and set himself on fire that spread the fire essentially across the Arab world. And that's, I think, the best thing about the Arab Spring, that it's coming from within and not from an outside entity. And America should help and assist and aid in any way we can, not in the old ways that we did, not with guns, I don't think, and weapons and control their economics.
And that's where we shouldn't use our old path, which would be to go in and create economic sanctions. That is, we should make an interdependency between our nations and between our cultures, to go in and form those ties that will bind us to help those communities be able to get that level of representation they want in their governments. Because the old idea of segregating them economically didn't work, but we do see now that they have some of the same desires for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
How do you sell that to the American people, this whole notion of cooperation, when the American populace is so paranoid about this whole notion of globalization and outsourcing and the foreign threat to the rampant joblessness that we're currently facing? How do we sell this, what I think we can all agree on is a proper vision of the future for our foreign engagement? How do we sell that to the people, though?
Well, I think that what the future holds for the Middle East is very difficult to tell. Not for the people in the Pentagon. If they tell you that they know what will happen in the Middle East in the future, they are probably engaging in 21st century witchcraft. We don't know. We don't know. And that is what bothers Washington and the European allies. The people who have risen up to fight for their rights in Egypt, in Libya, and these other places, we don't know them. We don't know what they will do. But now it is clear that the policies that Eisenhower adopted many years ago in bringing military officers to the U.S. to be trained, has worked very well in Egypt. So the U.S. foreign policy is reaping dividends because all of those who are leading the country in Egypt now were either trained here or had several years of education in the United States. So the emerging government will be friendly to us. But in Libya, the defense secretary said that he doesn't know these people. He doesn't know what they are up to. In fact, they have engaged in abuses against African foreigners who came to Libya to work and have killed many of them in cold blood. So this have been documented. But the point is that the stability that was enjoyed in the Middle East came as a result of U.S. courting the autocrats there. As long as we court them in Syria, in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, in Bahrain, they were our own autocrats. So we were fine. Now the people rising up on the streets, we don't know them. And that is scary. It should be scary, at least for now.
Yeah, so maybe the concept of delayed gratification can come into play on a larger scale for our nation. We have to sacrifice some of that control for the long-term benefit of better relations with those nations.
And I'd like to talk a little bit about post-9/11 and the U.S. embassies. And there's a book, and I can't remember the title right now, but one of the chapters was Where the Birds Don't Fly. And it talked about how, in the past, the old embassy for the United States was in the middle of the community. It was surrounded by schools, universities, churches, mosques, and would host the children of the leaders of that foreign nation in which that embassy resided. But after 9/11, they became nothing but military compounds surrounded by guards, surrounded by all sorts of protections, to the point where even the birds don't fly there. That was the interactions between the Americans to go in there and have that face-to-face interaction to show the different side of America, to be able to bring those people in to the embassy, have them trained at the embassy high school, sent back to American colleges to fulfill what Akbar said. That disappeared in some of the embassies in the 9/11 period, and we lost some of that information, and that's one reason why we really don't know who some of these people are.
So it seems like that you can't get away from the value of investment in experiential education, just getting to know other folks. If you believe that a nation tends to act in its best interests, who determines those interests? If it is our elected leaders, then ultimately their decisions are our responsibility as citizens of a democratic nation and of a connected globe. For the professors, I'm Rashid Carter.